get started with a couple of community announcements before we welcome our wonderful speaker tonight.
That might not be turned on yet.
This is your computer?
Mm-hmm.
There we go. Okay, so first, just a couple of upcoming events. We are currently in fish out of water season. Daryl has his shirt on right there. Have you run 5K today?
I walked in did laps at Jacobs.
Did you? Awesome. Who else has done their 5K already? This is a virtual 5K. Every year we run the Fish Out of Water 5K, and it's a way, we started it during the pandemic, but it's a way for all of our members around the country around the world to do some support for ocean science. The money that we raise with this goes to our Oceans for All campaign, which helps make the ocean and ocean education more accessible to people who can't easily address it. So I hope you're out there. Laura Lee, I know you and Christina got out and did your 5K on Monday. So please make sure you tag Reef and share all of those pictures with us. These were the promo pictures. A couple of other upcoming events. This Saturday, we have a cleanup that we're running in conjunction with Surfrider and Paddle the Florida Keys. Is Carolyn in here? Yeah. So that's this Saturday. The paddle boards and kayaks are free, right, for the cleanup, and we're really hoping to get a bunch of junk out of the mangroves and the ocean side there. Then in July is a great annual fish count, and on your chair you have a bunch of additional information about that. For the entire month of July, we're going to join people around the world, right, in counting fish. It's like if you're familiar with bird watching, I think on Christmas Day they do, or the day after Christmas, a big bird watching, a big bird count. This is a fish count, and there's so many fish in the ocean, we need a whole month to do it. We're running a whole bunch of special events during that period, which you can learn more about on your sheet. In particular, you might want to know that we're hosting a dive at the Blue Heron Bridge with Pura Vida divers. And so it's a chance to dive at an amazing site in West Palm Beach with a bunch of very expert fish ID and fish counters. You are definitely sure to add to your life list of fish if you join us there. So please check that out. And then right around the corner in August, we have our Lionfish Derby and Festival coming up. We originally had planned, as we have in the past, to do this at Postcard Inn in Isla Mirada, but they're not open for business yet. So we're going to be doing kind of a hybrid, but definitely the Derby is still happening. You can register online. There's some information there about some of our sponsors and the costs. But the fun event is really going to be on the Saturday of that weekend, August 17th, at Florida Keys Brewing Company, an event called Invaders on Tap, where we're going to have some music, some events, some lionfish tasting. I think, what was the alternate name for this event? Was Spinal Tap or something, but some people didn't get it or whatever. I don't really know. But anyway, please mark your calendars in August for this. Raise awareness about lionfish and invasive species and what Reef is doing to help keep those populations down. Speaking of diving, we still need, on an ongoing basis, volunteer divers to participate in one of our research projects where we use cameras to measure fish. It's really exciting research. There's a dive in June, and I believe that one is full, but there'll be other dives upcoming. So if you're at all interested in this, you don't need to be a super diver, but you need to be a pretty good diver and be able to handle the camera to help the data for that. It's a lot of fun. It's a way to participate directly in our research. Now, additional announcements that I want to make, and I didn't warn them that I was going to do this, but our summer interns are here. So I'd like them to stand up. Yay! And just very quickly shout out your name and where you're from.
I'm Diana from Tampa, Florida.
Yay!
I'm from Sydney. I'm Sydney. I'm from Atlanta.
Sydney from Atlanta. Great.
I'm Jasmine from the Bronx, New York.
Yay, Jasmine from the Bronx.
My name is Annika from San Diego, California.
Annika from San Diego. But please, yes, thank you. And we're really happy they're here for the whole summer. So you'll see them at the Lionfish Derby, at a bunch of other events that we're having through the summer. And I don't see Carolyn in here right now. Okay, we'll come back to that. Want to say thank you to our volunteers. All the wonderful food that you just ate outside was thanks to them. Thank you all for bringing food, and for David, who helps us with the live streaming and audio visual back there. And again, thank you to Martha for being here. The only community announcement that I know off the bat that I want to call people's attention to is that this Saturday, Moat Marine Lab is doing one of their Leech Watch training. I did this last year. It was really interesting. Sitting at every house at 10 a.m. on Saturday. And for those of us who are used to looking around and paying attention, we go diving. Here's a chance to do it not with fish, but with coral. So they need citizen science data of divers, helping them track how the coral is doing this summer. I don't think it's going to be a fun way to participate in, but as we all know, if we don't have data, we can't do anything about it. So I really encourage all of our reef members to take part in that. You do not have to register. It's free. Do you have to register for it? Pre-registration is requested. So I have the article up here. Any other community announcements for the good of the marine conservation community? Hearing none. Just want to remind people, if you are not already on our mailing list for the Reef Campus and Keys Community Newsletter, it's a great thing to be on, because then you get to know about our upcoming speakers and other events. And we'd love to have you on that list. So one more slide of small print. We are delighted to have support from the National Endowment for the Humanities, Florida Humanities, and the Florida Keys and Key West Tourism Board for events like these that really help us get our message out in the community. And as you can see, although the funding was provided, the people and what I'm saying and what anybody else is saying here is not necessarily reflecting their views. So we say thank you to them. And then, without further ado, I'd like to ask you to help me welcome Cori Convertito to come here and talk to us about following the fish Hemingway in the Florida Keys.
Thank you.
This is your computer, right? You know,
Yeah, it is my computer.
It's not my phone.
Yeah, that's your phone. My computer. Well, thank you very much for having me come here and talk about Hemingway. I'm usually in Key West talking all the Hemingway, because that's all what people realize, because of course he really ushered in our drinking culture down there. People were drinking long before him, but still he gets all the credit for it. And the thing that struck me about Hemingway really was that he doesn't get a lot of credit for a lot of the marine science initiatives that he took. And in doing a lot more research about that, I came up with this presentation because I want you to have a better understanding of Hemingway. I want people to see a different side of him, because he certainly was, quite interested in the early days of what we consider, I think, marine conservation. And I will just preface this with, I am a historian. I'm not a scientist, so I'm happy to answer any questions I can from a historian perspective. But if you have questions about some of the projects that he works on, I will direct you exactly where you need to be, and it's not with me. All right. So we talk about Hemingway because he lives and works in the Florida Keys for the 1930s, and he immerses himself in the culture, and that, like all parts of the culture, hence the drinking thing. But he certainly popularizes fishing and big game fishing in the Florida Keys because of his notoriety. Newspapers and magazines are reporting on him, what his exploits are when he's not writing, because he is quite a celebrity as such when he moves to Key West. So he does a lot to promote it, even if it's unintentional in some ways. I think while it's well known that he is an avid big game fisherman in the Florida Keys, I think people sort of overlook or don't even know about the conservation efforts that he goes to, the lengths he goes to, to kind of promote that. conservation. And so this talk is not going to sway you. He's still the drinker and the writer that you know, but I want you to just kind of see a little bit of a different facet to Hemingway and how that relates to the Florida Keys, and how he finds his way to Key West. So because I'm a historian, I love context. So I'm going to start with little mini Hemingway here, right? I know it's really, there's some great photos in his mom's scrapbook. So, and the reason I share this is because you're going to see that his love for fishing starts at a very young age. His family does a lot to promote that. Maybe not this early, but certainly pretty early. So he's born in July of 1899, which is why we celebrate Hemingway Days in Key West in July, because we celebrate his birth month. And he is one of 5 siblings. He's kind of stuck in the middle, and he gets a little lost. And before Ernest is born, his parents are quite well off. His father's a doctor. His mom's a little of a bon vivant, if you will. She loves to socialize. They're in a rich suburb outside of Chicago. And what the family does before Ernest is born, they buy 200 feet of waterfront property on Lake Walloon. And they build this very pretty ramshackled cabin. I mean, it's nothing luxurious, and the family of 7 is going to spend a lot of the summer up there and weekends when the weather's nice. But they build this house and they call it Windermere. And for the majority of the mom's scrapbook from the kids growing up, it's going to be taken when Hemingway and the siblings are all at this lake house. And this is his parents. They establish this property and they go out to Windermere a lot to kind of escape Chicago, the big, yeah, I know. Listen, I'm telling, I love these, right? Okay, so pretty early on in Hemingway's life, his dad teaches him and all the other kids basically all the outdoors, right? So you have a love of fishing and hunting from a very, very small age, and they are at this house in Windermere. They spend a lot of time, and this is their recreational time. And he discovers it and he loves it. He's one of the kids that really does latch onto this fishing and hunting, kind of these recreations. The siblings were into it, but not as much as Ernest. He certainly was. And I think that, having this remoteness too, like being outside of the city, being on this lake, really resonates with Hemingway as he gets older and he lives in these big cities and he doesn't like it. He always wants an escape, and that's how he ends up and finds places like Key West, or when he goes to just outside of Havana in Cuba, or his other place that he spends a lot of time is Ketchum, Idaho, which again is a really remote place. I think Hemingway, because it was instilled that they can escape that sort of hustle and bustle of Chicago. And he always equated that sort of remote time, that removal time, with fishing and hunting, certainly. And I think that we'll have some more pictures to prove it. But there's just the family, because they're cute. And there's Hemingway with the worst haircut his mom probably could have given him, I think. So this is the family. That's their cabin in the back. This is at Windermere. And again, there's just a lot of these wonderful photos in his mother's scrapbook that shows the family enjoying the outdoors. This is Hemingway and his older sister on the lake at Walloon as they're going to go out fishing. And again, so you've got Hemingway over here and his older sister fishing on Lake Walloon. And it's muscle memory for him, I think. So there's all these countless photos. I promise they're not all in here, but they're just so cute. I can't resist the urge to show you all these pictures of Hemingway fishing. And what I love is on this one, his mom writes "The Lone Fisherman," just 2 years old. And that, I know, right? And that's Ernest fishing. But again, it's not just the age, it's understanding what your child is into and cultivating that. And that's the family does really well. The other thing, one of these things that he writes really early on is this little story about himself. Hello, my name is Ernest Miller Hemingway. My favorite sports are trout fishing, hiking, shooting, football. So you can see that he really does enjoy this outdoor. And this is one of the early stories that he writes for a little a school assignment. again, he's, continues to spend that time. He's maturing. He does get outdoors a lot and really loves it. Again, I'm going to stop with all the family photos, but I just can't. Maybe not one, just one more. So this is Hemingway near Windermere Cottage on Walloon Lake. And again, his parents were, his dad was, I wouldn't call him a conservationist. What I think his dad was taught this lesson at a very young age. If you are going to fish or you're going to hunt, you need to use the animal. There needs to be a need for the animal, right? You don't go out for the shooting just for the sport of it. You have to have a purpose for it. So much so that Ernest and his friend, who stayed at kind of an adjacent cottage up at the lake, they shot a porcupine because it was harassing the Hemingway family's dog, and the dad made him eat it. Okay, so I kind of appreciate the way that the Hemingway father is sort of raising these kids to understand that there's a purpose and an intention as they go out and hunt or shoot. But they did not spend a lot of time on the lake when he gets a little older. World War I breaks out. Hemingway is avid to go. He wants to go to war. He's too young. He has to get his parents to sign off on it. They absolutely refuse to do that. But you know who takes him younger? The Red Cross. And so Ernest enrolls in the Red Cross. He goes over to Italy. He wants to be on the war front. He has that sense of adventure that you do sort of equate to Hemingway in a lot of his novels if you read them. So he goes with the Red Cross to Italy. He's part of an ambulance unit. It's boring, apparently, to Hemingway. So he transfers to another section. And what he does is work on the Italian front, and he passes out alcohol, cigarettes, candy, whatever, to the Italian soldiers on the front. And Hemingway, it's pretty dangerous because they are getting shelled. And in July of 1918, this German mortar came over, exploded right near Hemingway, and he had about 200 plus bits of shrapnel in his body that extended from his head, torso, and leg. So they sent him to a hospital in Milan. The Italian soldiers who were adjacent to Hemingway did not make it. So that's how close Hemingway came to not making it. And again, I think the reason I tell you this is to kind of set the stage for how, when he does something, he goes hard, right? It's something, all the activities that he really enjoys. So this is Hemingway at the hospital in Milan, and we are the beneficiaries. We have Hemingway's original uniform. This is what he was wearing when the mortar shell went off. So we have this on display at the museum, and you could see the blood on the pants as part of his uniform. And there really aren't as many bits of shrapnel as there's some of his stories were, but it's like, how big does the fish get every time you tell the story? There's more shrapnel. But anyway, all right. So he comes back from war, hates America, wants to leave. He gets married. Doesn't matter. First, I mattered to her. Right? We're going to bypass her for the purposes of this conversation because he meets Pauline in Paris. This is his second wife, Pauline Pfeiffer. She's working for Vogue magazine as a writer in Paris. She gets pregnant and she wants to come home. She's originally from Arkansas, wants to come back to the States to have the baby. She doesn't want to have it in France. And so Hemingway and Pauline take a liner, because that's the only way really to travel at that point across the Atlantic. They take a ship from Paris. They go to Havana, Cuba. Now, the plan is that they're going to hit Havana. They're going to take the ferry service that was connected to Flagler's Railroad that just, ran outside the door here. When they get to Havana, they're going to take the steamship over to Key West. Pauline's uncle happened to be rich and said, I'm going to give you a car. I'm buying you a car as a wedding present. You can pick it up in Key West and then drive to Piggott, Arkansas. Great. Well, they do that. They get as far as Key West. They get to the Ford dealership. They walk in and say, we're here. We're the Hemingways. We're here for our car. Sorry, not here. You're going to have to wait. The dealership did not have it. And this is like the best thing that could have happened to Hemingway, right? Because he found Key West by accident, really. He should have been on the road, but this was the Ford dealership at the time, Ford dealership downstairs, and the Ford dealership ran a hotel upstairs. And so Hemingway and Paul, very pregnant Pauline, were stuck in this hotel waiting for a car. They're waiting 6 weeks for the car to get there. That gives Hemingway enough time to realize what a fishing mecca the Florida Keys are. He makes friends. He's writing during the day, but in the mornings, and then he's walking along the waterfront, and he finds this is the Bight in Key West, and there's just there's fishermen and captains and spongers and turtlers, and you name it, you can find them in this area. And Hemingway starts making friends with all of them because they have boats, right? I'm sure he liked them too, but they had boats. And so he finds these, sort of notable, well-known, and everybody's still a conch then because Key West hasn't really been discovered. It's the Depression. People don't have money. It's not touristy. So he's finding the right people because it's easy to do at the time. So he meets the Thompsons, who become very good friends of his. The Thompsons have a boat, take Hemingway fishing. He's smitten. He's smitten with Key West. He's smitten with the bars, and he's smitten with the fishing. His wife ended up leaving early on the train because she was about ready to burst with the baby. And Hemingway stayed behind to wait for the car. And so he got alone time there too, which probably was not a good thing for, for Hemingway, but that's all right. So he meets the Thompsons. They eventually buy the Hemingway home. If anybody's been to Key West and gone to the Hemingway house, it was the only really large property on the island. He convinced Pauline to buy it as a winter home. They would figure out where they were going to live during the summer months. During the winter, he wanted to be in Key West because he wanted to fish. They could still get to Europe very easily on a liner. They could be with her family in Arkansas. He was less excited about going to visit his family, but they bought this pretty large estate, an old, beautiful big property in Key West. And there he starts writing all of these stories that kind of are synonymous with him, to have and have not, which he bases on a fisherman, or actually a rum runner, fisherman legally, rum runner illegally, based in Key West. So he's taking this, his storylines from his surroundings. He also writes Death in the Afternoon, Green Hills of Africa, et cetera, et cetera. While he's here, because he's this celebrity by now, he is spending time with these other notables. So Key West is in love with Hemingway for lots of reasons. He's rich. It's the Depression, and he can spend his money in bars. He can go out fishing, and all of his rich friends are invited to come see him. And so John Dos Passos, who's on this side here, that's Hemingway over here, he comes down quite a lot, and the pair go fishing, introduces them to all his friends. He takes other people's boats. This is them in Cuba, landing some fish early on before Hemingway gets his own boat. So he's kind of getting a feel for what the fishing climate is here, I think much to the chagrin of Pauline, who goes on some trips, but not all. He is going out. He goes out with Sloppy Joe a lot, who you probably heard of because he's got a bar. And so this excitement, being able to travel far, get places like the Dry Tortugas, get out to Cuba, get over to Bimini, that excites Hemingway. And it really fuels his desire to kind of perfect, because his dad always instilled in him the ways to perfect getting your prey, right? You're thinking like you want a boat, that you want tuna, you want a marlin. You've got to figure out, Hemingway has to figure out the best way to do, the most effective way to do that. And so he enjoys, the hunt, if you will. So he spends a lot of time there. And finally, this is him and Sloppy Joe and some kid, I don't know, in Havana. So he writes to his cousin, and you can just read that if you'd like. But, he says that there's a bootlegger here. He's talking about Sloppy Joe, and writes all about how he knows how to get to Cuba. He knows how to get rum from there and bring it back. And he's a damn good fisherman on top of it, right? So Hemingway's having the time of his life, all under the umbrella of these fishing excursions. So he absolutely loves it. And then how you can come back to Key West and we don't care, right? The law doesn't matter. It's prohibition. You can't be doing this. But certainly Hemingway seems to do that. And then this is just him again, out fishing with friends in Havana. More friends from the average friends, Waldo Pierce is quite a famous artist. And so they come down. And finally, Hemingway decides, he's already bought the house. He's got the wife. She's now had a second child. It's time for Hemingway to really invest. If he wants to be a fisherman in the Florida Keys, he's got to invest in his own boat. And because he had been on other people's boats, he had fished, he understood what he wanted in a boat. So he goes to a Wheeler shipyard in Brooklyn. He had been on a African safari with his wife and some friends. He was, his publisher wanted him to write about his safari adventure. So they went to New York. The guy handed him a check in advance and said, okay, this is for the story you're going to write about your safari. Here's $3,000. We'll see when your story gets here. Hemingway leaves his publisher's office, goes to Wheeler Shipyard in Brooklyn with the check and says, I want to put a down payment on a boat. And that's what he does. But he adapts one of there was like a standard version called the Playmate. Hemingway decides to adapt it to his needs and his specifications, because again, he has been fishing here in other people's boats. What was lacking, what wasn't, and he puts some very interesting, which I think now you're like, oh, sure, of course you would, but most fishing boats didn't have a live well, which is unusual now, right? Okay, so Hemingway insisted on a live well. Hemingway insisted on a roller bar in the back. So if he was boating fish, there was a roller on the back so you can boat the fish much easier. Again, not standard, an idea of Hemingway's to add to his boat because he saw people struggling. And then he wanted the cabins to be reconfigured a little bit so he can maximize the space and have people come with him. So he buys this, and he puts a trawling motor on it as well. So, he really is thinking about how he can fish in the Florida Keys using their base model and adapting it to what he's doing. So this is Hemingway in the back of the Pilar. He names it Pilar because it's his second wife's nickname, which doesn't work out well because he's going to have 2 more wives after that. So the finished boat's going to cost about $7,500. The shipyard brings it down to Miami. Hemingway's got to go up there and pick it up and bring it back to Key West, and he christens it the Pilar there. And for the most part, most of the images you're going to see of Hemingway in Key West, if it's not in a bar, I don't want to stress, I'm not trying to, but that's what he did a lot. If it's not in a bar, he's on the Pilar. Right. That's most of that. You don't see him with his kids very often in photos. It's bar or boat, which I know I can't argue with. But again, there's just another picture of Hemingway, and then at the helm of the Pilar. And then, so he's on board. So one of the things, right after he gets his boat, he invites one of his friends to come down. This guy named Mike Strader, who's a writer, and invites Mike down. They both don't really like each other. They're friends, but they're frenemies, and they're very competitive with one another. And so we invite Mike down. They're going to go fishing for marlin. That's Hemingway says when he gets this boat, that was the idea. Is I really would like to boat marlin or big game fish. So he invites Mike down. They go out, and Mike hooks a marlin, and he starts, trying to bring it in. Well, Hemingway decides he's going to shoot at it with a gun. Because Hemingway, that's what he does. But he shoots himself first in the kneecap, but it's fine. They keep going. And finally, long story short, is they're fighting this fish. They're really kind of fighting Hemingway too, because Hemingway doesn't want him to get this fish because of this whole love-hate relationship between the two. I'm going somewhere with this, I really promise. Because what they realize, and this Mike Strader writes this, as soon as I hooked him, I knew it was a big one. Then he came out of the water walking on his tail, how exciting they were because they were off of Bimini, how they wanted to land it. But Hemingway and he were trying to figure out the best way to boat the fish, and all the sharks turn up, right? Because the fish is fighting and stirring up the water. Sharks are, kind of circling now. Hemingway's trying to shoot them. Eventually, when they land this fish, okay, this is big one. Then this is Mike over here, Hemingway over here. These are Hemingway's fish, right? A little smaller. And this is the one that Mike boated, but he got what they called apple cord, right? I'm sure you all know this from your marine science. So this marlin is apple cord. And Hemingway is bound and determined to find ways to avoid this. He wants to boat a big marlin full. Like, he doesn't want the sharks. How do you prevent this? What's the strategies in order to, land a fish that size, but get it full? Because if it's not, and it doesn't count toward any record out there. Okay, so he was bound and determined to do that. And also, if you've ever read The Old Man and the Sea, anybody, right? That's where you see where that comes from, because the old man is doing the exact same thing. So it comes from this experience with Mike Strader out in the Bahamas. But he's out there and he's trying to perfect his technique. He's pretty successful. In 1935, that we can find records of, he boats a full tuna, an unmarred tuna. He's the first person to do that, right? Because everybody else is either, pulling them in, they fight with them, and then you have the shark thing or other, other predators trying to get at the fish. So Hemingway gets credit for this unmutilated tuna that he lands out in the Bahamas. So he's, as you can see, he's kind of perfecting that, and he's involved because he is trying to figure out the science behind how to boat fish. And he keeps doing that, although he still keeps a gun just in case, which probably is like an unfair advantage. But he writes a lot of letters to people when he realizes that it's possible with just your sweat, like your know-how and your sweat equity, to have a fair fight between the fishermen and the fish. So he stops using weapons as often, unless there's some kind of imminent danger on the boat. But he writes to his friends saying he wants a fair fight and how to do that. And he comes at it very scientifically. And so this is him just again fishing from the Pilar. And he's really this architect of big game fishing, because that's the goal now, is to boat them, get them measured. And if you want to do, he would catch and release if he didn't think it was worth it. If he didn't think the fish was big enough for a record, somebody would photograph it for him, and then he would do a release. And so he really brings in this big game fishing. And because he is a celebrity, and he's in magazines with images of these large fish, of course, it's going to attract more and more people to the Florida Keys. What Zane Grey did here around that same time period in the Upper Keys, Hemingway is doing down in Key West, in that Caribbean Atlantic region that you get a lot of tourism. And so Hemingway really does sharpen up his skills. So that's his family there out in Bimini, and all of these marlins that he's boated, and you can see that they're boated, they're unmutilated. And so I think he figured out the ways, and people would come to him and ask him how, why, what are your techniques? What are your methods? And Hemingway was very willing to share, because he wanted competition. Right? He didn't want to necessarily, he still thought he was going to be the best, even if other people were trying to fish, because it's Hemingway, and that was, his machismo. And so he uses these fishings to, for have and have not, the book that he bases with the fishermen. So he's utilizing, his locale in the fishing knowledge, because he puts that into have and have not. One of the things he really does that I find as a huge benefit as a researcher, and one of the reasons that I think Hemingway doesn't get a lot of credit, is he was a meticulous note taker, and that included his fishing log. So this is Ernest Hemingway, Key West, Florida fishing log. He keeps track of everything. He keeps track of the weather, the tide, the moon phase, who came with him, what bait they're using. And there's a lot of scientific data in here that can be extrapolated out to kind of work through like what he caught, where he went. I don't think it's as comprehensive for somebody to do a full study, but he cared. He cared to make these notations. Why? If you had your spot and you kept going to the same spot week in, week out, why bother with the notes? You know where you're going. Who cares who you're with, as long as you bring home the fish? That it wasn't the end result necessarily for Hemingway. A lot of it was to do with him really getting involved with the scientific and research part of it by keeping these notes. So you can see, December over here in January, heavy swells, who I went out with, Charles, and Ernest Hemingway went out, Golf Saunders, and then what they caught as well. His handwriting's a little atrocious, so I don't apologize because it's not mine. But as you can see, like some of these, where they are in Key West and what they caught, how many dolphin, barracuda, grouper, etc., that he highlights in this text. But and also, as I say, the weather is really important as well. So it kind of gives you an indication of when they're going out. And this is from a different year, 1934, Key West, and then again 5 grouper, 1 jack, and all he catches, and he's still meticulously, several years later, still recording this data habitually when he goes out. It wasn't he started it because he was excited and then it petered off. He did this consistently through his time in and then somebody owed him money for gas, right? And so he kept track of this. And so I kind of think that he leans a little bit, and for reasons I'll kind of explain, because of his reputation. Hemingway, he was named president of the IGFA in 1940, and it's after he moves to Cuba. But I feel like there's these leanings toward him being a naturalist that don't get explored enough. I mean, the fishing logs are great, but he does these other activities, and he's in pretty regular contact with folks at the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia. They reach out to him because they see what he's doing. They see the type of species. They heard his reputation for his meticulous note gathering, understands the waters. And so the folks from the Academy of Natural Sciences, Charles Cadwallader was the director at the time. He reaches out to Hemingway personally and asks if Hemingway can just share information with the Academy. Hemingway says, "I'll do one better. Why don't you come to Key West? I'll take you out fishing on Pilar. Come down, make the trips. I'll tell you what time of year, what fish do you want to, what are you wanting to see? What data are you trying to capture? Because that'll dictate what time of the year you should come down." And he stays in this contact with Cadwallader, and he wants these fish here that are not in their collection to get cataloged. So he starts calling them. He refers to the team, so Cadwallader and everybody else that comes down, as the scientificos. So in all this correspondence that between he and his friends saying, "I'm hosting the scientificos next week for a month. We're going to Cuba." They specifically wanted to study marlin in the Florida Strait. That's what they had asked Hemingway. So they came down in late July of 34. And so they're with Pauline or with his other fishing friends, and they're plying the waters out here, collecting with the scientificos all of this data on marlin fishing that resides now at the Academy in Philadelphia. They classified Fowler, who comes with them. He's like the Cadwallader is the head of the Academy. There's a scientist who comes down named Fowler, and he classifies for their records, like 25,000 different species of fish, which is impossible. But this is what he's writing in his records that are unknown to the Academy. So they feel like this is a very rewarding trip, whether or not they're doing a lot of duplication work. Certainly it's something that the scientificos feel really validated. So he lets them come out, and it is this, and Hemingway's doing catch and release with them. And again, that's not really a thing as of yet. Not everybody's participating in that. And the scientificos, again, this is just correspondence. They keep up this correspondence with Hemingway after they come down on this particular visit. And Hemingway is still, even though despite the fact that the scientificos have returned to Philadelphia, Hemingway still is collecting species that they think, "Oh, you didn't see this while you were here. I'm going to ship it to you." And so Hemingway he sends up in a box, and he writes to him in 1934, and he says, and he describes a tuna that he's sending to Philadelphia, saying this fish in life was dark purple on the back, opulescent on the flanks and belly, with a gold rather than silver shine. I mean, it kind of, to me, that's a little bit more than just talking to your friend, right? Like there's really an observation here that he's making and sharing with these. And Hemingway wrote, "The fins were purple, blue on the top and silver on the bottom." And then because he's Hemingway, he says, if you don't want him as a specimen and he gets there in good shape, wash the salt out, cut the meat off of both sides and the backbone and broil it, which is, I think, kind of funny. But the Academy still has the tuna. The Academy kept the tuna that Hemingway sent to them. Didn't come down and collect a different species, kept it. Which I think, helps, to me, validates that relationship between this very scientific academy who's looking to do research and Hemingway's real attempts at participating in that, not just for the delights of fishing, but also because he cares and actually wants to extend knowledge, local knowledge of Florida Keys fishing with people who can disseminate that information much wider than Hemingway can. So they didn't broil the tuna, it's still in their collection. He continues to keep his log well beyond the Scientificos, and as I said, they correspond regularly. And the Scientificos, they're so grateful for his continued involvement. Their relationship lasts for years. In terms of this correspondence back and forth, that they established a Hemingway archive at the Academy, which still exists. And there's all this correspondence and records of what they did research on, what Hemingway had shared with them. And Dr. Fowler, who was the scientist who would come on the expedition here in 34, he actually named a spiny cheek scorpion fish for Hemingway. So the scientific name, right, it has Hemingway in it as a thank you to Hemingway for all the work that he had done to, elevate the research on this, Gulf of Mexico, Gulf Stream, that was lacking in their collection. So I think to me, that's great that they had that relationship. And to me, it demonstrates that Hemingway cared about the bigger picture, about conservation, about understanding. Right. So, I think, kind of the point for me is to kind of think of him outside of just being a sport fisherman. There was that care and diligence that he took to report that, and the fact that he was, catch and release. And I'm going to share just a few more. Hemingway, even when Hemingway moves to Cuba in 39 with his soon to be third wife, he keeps in touch with the Scientificos even from Cuba. So the correspondence extends well beyond that. So this is him, and that's the third wife in Cuba. So he leaves drinking Key West. He goes to this very remote, Key West starts getting a little busier by then. He likes the remoteness of Cuba. His wife also likes the remoteness of Cuba as well. They move out there, but he brings the new wife, but he also brings Pilar. Right. He didn't leave his boat. He left his wife. He left his kids in Key West. Right. But he took the boat. And it's still in Cuba at the house, the Finca Vieja, where he and Martha had purchased the house. So Pilar still exists, and it's there to see it. But he brings the boat over there, and he continues using the boat for fishing, for scientific research. And at one point during World War II, he was hunting for U-boats out there. It was like a whole crazy thing. But he continues his love of fishing in the Gulf Stream, even though he's living 90 miles or plus from here. And that experience while he's living in Cuba, this experience of fishing, that experience with Mike Strader when they're out, and Mike lands this big marlin, Hemingway now sits down, takes the time to write The Old Man and the Sea, thinking about that experience with, fishing with Mike and that fish being apple cored, and makes it a Cuban book, right? It's set in Cuba, Cuban fishermen, and it's amazing how many, Hemingway writes what he knows. Certainly, he's not ashamed to admit most of his books come from firsthand experience, but I think very few people actually know how he got this firsthand experience. Trying to boat this large marlin. Of course, he's by himself and models this old man on himself, but that's neither here nor there. And he wins. He writes this, and so he's awarded the Pulitzer Prize for fiction for this work because it's so impactful. And again, it's just demonstrating his love for fishing in this area, in this region, whether it's from here or in Cuba, because he had continued to fish. The Cuban government started in 1950, the Ernest Hemingway fishing tournament that runs every other year, and it runs out of Coimar, close right to near Havana. It runs every 2 years. Sometimes communism got in the way and it didn't run every 2 years, but for the most part, it runs every 2 years, and it's a tip of the cap to Ernest, and it's a catch and release tournament. And again, I think it's that subtle nod to Hemingway and understanding like what his what his tactics were in fishing was, okay, get the picture, get the measurements, let it go. And that's part of the Hemingway tournament. And it's a pretty big one. I mean, Americans really don't participate, but other Caribbean countries do in pretty robust numbers. And actually, they just had a tournament the end of May. It was this a couple weeks ago was the last tournament they had for him or in his honor. So I hope I kind of wanted to cover, and I'll finish this off because A, it's time, and B, I'm hoping that you take away from this idea of a different side of Hemingway, not just the sport fisherman for the sport, right? There's another level to Hemingway, or levels, I think, in wanting to do research, in understanding and respecting nature in a way that it was broadcast out pretty loudly, especially when he became president of the IGFA, and that was something they sort of honed on and wanted to share with their members. Is you don't have to kill everything, right? You can go out, you can get the information, you can do scientific research. It doesn't mean you don't have to prove yourself by boating every single fish all the time, because it will have an effect on the population. And I always think back to that porcupine that Hemingway's dad must have made him eat, right? Like, don't kill anything that you're really not going to use. And he does, so he's not, doesn't escape that completely. But I think that there's a residual there from his dad that kind of made him an appreciator of nature and the environment and the species that live in it. And so I think, I kind of end the talk there, but I hope you can walk away knowing that this little boy grows up and tries to be a bit of a conservationist, a little bit of a naturalist. He's not a scientist, but he certainly wants to be helpful in that realm. And I think, even your introduction, asking people like, hey, you're going diving, go do this, right? Like that's what Hemingway's doing, right? Like, he wants to participate. He wants to be relevant and helpful for the scientific community to know. And I think that Hemingway doesn't get a lot of credit for that, or his contributions to the scientific world. That's me done.
Gosh, thank you so much. That was interesting. I have 100 questions, but I'll let other people ask their questions first. Marta.
So I just have a question. Why so many of these pictures came from the JFK Museum?
Yeah. So they bought them. So Hemingway, there was a big archive. There was a big thing because a lot of the photos that were in Hemingway's personal collection, he took with him to Cuba. And then when Castro takes power, no one can come in and just remove his property. So he was with his fourth wife at the time, and they wouldn't even allow Mary to come in and remove property from Finca Vieja because Hemingway left. He didn't like Castro, and they decided to move, but they left all their belongings, assuming they could at some point come back. What JFK does, the library steps in because they are a educational entity that can take possession of what's there, and they can hold the archive. So they're the ones that coordinate with the Cuban government, because the Cuban government is not going to take care of anything. It was still private property, and JFK took on that responsibility for going to Cuba and getting everything archived and making sure they were removing things that were really germane to Hemingway and his life. So that's why they have it. It's a weird place because he never really lived in Boston. He never, but they were the ones that took the helm in trying to recoup what they could from Hemingway's legacy that he brought over to Cuba.
Other questions? Hal, I'm going to ask you to talk into the microphone.
Are any of the six-toed cats left?
Okay, so Hemingway didn't own six-toed cats. Hemingway didn't own cats in Key West. I'm sorry to burst every tourist bubble. I know, I'm sorry. Hemingway had cats in Cuba. He and his third wife had cats, and the second wife, who still remained in Key West with her two boys, Hemingway had a child with the first wife. So Pauline stays with the second, third. She gets them cats after Hemingway's gone. And so Hemingway didn't have them, and there's still six-toed cats on the property. But Hemingway, they should be the Pauline cats instead of the Pfeiffer cats instead of the Hemingway cats. But yeah, they're there, but no credit is due to Hemingway.
So one of my questions is, you did such a lovely job of telling us about the origins of his appreciation for being in nature and the fishing. Where do you think the origins of his affinity with the scientific, the observation, the data collecting? He was a journalist also when he was in Europe, right? But do we know from his family or early upbringing where that attention to detail and the desire to record and tell other people about what he saw, where that came from?
That's a great question. Yeah, his dad. Absolutely, his father. His father was a doctor, kept meticulous notes as just part of his practice. And I think they were copious note takers, because even his mother in her scrapbook, she's not very brief in her description sometimes about, like, she keeps diaries that are very lengthy entries. I think the family has a lot of time and they have that attention to detail. His mom was a music teacher too. So I think she had that kind of teaching, that looking at the bigger picture in terms of capturing information and extending its life by being able to, kind of recall and share. And Hemingway's dad was the same in his practice and with the kids at the lake. His dad would, when they would go out boating, okay, what are the conditions? And you're taking this little rowboat out, and they would go without adults, but the adults could see them, but still, the dad would tell him, think before you go. What are the conditions today? What is your objective out there? What are you carrying with you? Is it too much? Do you have enough? And I think it really set Hemingway on this path of making deliberate choices and writing them down, because then you have reflection to see what worked and what didn't. But it's definitely his father.
Could he speak Spanish, and did he ever write a story in Spanish?
Yes, it's a great question. Yes and yes. He could speak Spanish. He spent a lot of time in Spain during the Spanish Civil War, working as a journalist for American news outlets, but he understood Spanish. He was fluent in Spanish. And frankly, Key West, even when he moves there it gets there in 1928 originally, most of the population there is Cuban. At the time he moves there, you rarely heard English in comparison to Spanish in Key West at the time. So he already had some working knowledge of it, but he could sharpen it in Key West. And then when he went to Spain and lived over there during the Spanish Civil War, he really became fluent. And then he wrote articles in it. He never wrote full books, but they translated his works into Spanish, and he would check them because he wanted to make sure whoever the translator was understanding, the context or the syntax that he was using, and making sure that the reader of a Spanish version would understand what Hemingway was trying to drive forward. Yeah. He's an interesting guy.
Jessica.
I know nothing about Hemingway, despite having lived here for a long time. It was never something I followed. Did he pass on any of his naturalist tendencies to his children?
No, not really. His kids there's some mental illness going on in that family too. And I think the kids had some struggles, especially when he was an absentee father, and where Hemingway had his dad Clarence to kind of guide him through those early stages of life and instill that. Hemingway was mostly an absentee dad due to fishing or covering things for journals. So, I mean, one of his kids goes off and be a doctor. One of them was a cross-dresser. And I can't remember. The other one was a writer of some repute, but the family it really did, that sort of legacy stopped with him. And I think that's a reflection on him not spending as much time with his kids, and 4 wives. It's a lot for families to process, I think, and kids to feel like there's a home and they get education or attention through that. It's quite difficult. So no, none of them really, he doesn't really instill that in the kids.
Lori.
No, we had a place in Sun Valley when I was a kid.
Oh, did you?
So yeah, Hemingway was a big thing there. But just wondering if if he continued his conservation. Obviously, I'm sure he did, but to this extent, and does he have notes, and are they in record for like probably fly fishing and trout fishing and stuff?
From when he was a kid, a lot of that is with his mother. So the JFK, in Sun Valley, I don't know what happened to a lot of those archives. Mary, the 4th wife, went to Sun Valley after he died, and she cleared out the house. What she did with it, how she divvied it up, I'm not really sure what they did with the Sun Valley material. I know that there's a Hemingway museum there. Or I'm told there's a Hemingway museum. I don't know how much they received as part of the dissolution of that property in Ketchum, but I don't know. Or she donated it elsewhere, or she kept it within her family. And
they've never recovered all of his lost material from his first wife in Paris, right?
No.
She lost his entire years of work.
Yeah, so his first wife had all the records, and because he just picked up and left pretty quickly, she held on to everything, and she tried to ransom it for a while, because she thought he would want it, and he said no. And actually, the reason we even have his uniform, we have a pretty decent Hemingway archive or collection at our institution, is because when Hemingway left here in 1939 to go with his 3rd wife to Cuba, he didn't want to leave he didn't want to take everything with him, but he didn't want his 2nd wife to have it. And what he did was he paid Sloppy Joe the bar. There was a back room there, and he paid the bar to be a storage unit for a lot of his material that he didn't want to take to Cuba, but he also didn't want Pauline to have. And when he died, Mary, the 4th wife, came to Key West and was like, we don't know what to do with it. You had all these treasures in the back, and they gave some of it to the library, the Key West Library, and they gave the rest of it to us, our institution, and some of it went to Hemingway. Hired a guy who Pauline knew his family from home. It was like this whole complicated thing. Anyway, the family was still living in Key West, and they gave a portion to the Bruce family. So some of these are from the Bruce family archive. The Bruces were, she was like a 5th generation, his wife was a 5th generation conch, and they had just stayed. And they inherited some from Mary, but she picked what went where. Yeah. So, I mean, I kind of have a feeling if that's what she did here, she probably did a similar thing up there.
So fascinating. Thank you. Help me give a hand to Dr. Cori Convertito. I think, I hope you get a taste for, this is what Reef is all about, connecting people with oceans and stories about the oceans in ways that help us conserve them, not just as fish counters and fish ID, but also stories and photos and really examples from people all around different walks of life for how we know and appreciate our oceans. So we want to say thank you. I have, as a token of our appreciation, a very beautiful certificate.
It's fairly beautiful. Thank you.
For your archive later in life when they ask where you came to speak.
I just hope they don't find it at Sloppy Joe's.
Yes. Anyway, I think with that, we'll wrap it up.